The last time Britain had a serious conversation about its hottest day of the year, it was April. Kew Gardens in London recorded 26.5 degrees Celsius on April 8th, a reading described by the Met Office as exceptional for at least the first half of April, and the kind of number that made headlines precisely because it sat so far above the early April average of 12 to 15 degrees that it felt almost physically wrong. That April record has been sitting at the top of the 2026 temperature table for weeks. And now, in mid-May, there's a forecast on the table that could knock it off the top spot. Not by a fraction of a degree, not by a narrow margin that requires forensic inspection of the data, but by a number large enough to represent a genuine step change in what 2026 is doing to the UK's seasonal temperature record. Forecasters are pointing at 27 degrees Celsius for London and East Anglia. That is half a degree warmer than April's Kew Gardens reading. That is warmer than Honolulu. That is a potential new hottest day of the year for Britain, arriving in May, before the country has had any meaningful preparation time for the heat that is building behind it. The forecast that has placed 27 degrees Celsius on the UK temperature map is built on a high-pressure system drawing warm air northward from the European continent, creating the stable, sunny, light wind conditions under which surface temperatures can build steadily from the first hour of morning through to the late afternoon peak without any cloud cover moderating the solar radiation arriving at ground level. The southerly airflow, responsible for this warmth, is drawing air from a continental source, from France, from the Iberian Peninsula, from the warm air masses that have been accumulating over Europe throughout a spring that has run warmer than average across much of the landmass. When that already warm continental air arrives over the densely built urban surface of Greater London, the city's heat island effect amplifies it further, concentrating the highest readings at monitoring stations like Heathrow and Kew Gardens that sit within the urban footprint and consistently record among the highest temperatures in the country during any warm event. The forecast of 27 degrees Celsius for London and East Anglia is not a modeling outlier. It is the product of a well-understood and coherent atmospheric setup that multiple forecasting systems are resolving in agreement. The geography of where the warmth is concentrated tells its own story. London sits at the epicenter of the forecast, with Heathrow and Kew Gardens identified as the locations most likely to reach the 27-degree peak. East Anglia, including Norwich and Cambridge, mirrors this pattern, sitting in the same southerly airflow and sharing the flat, open terrain that allows continental air to maintain its temperature as it moves inland from the coast without the orographic cooling that hill terrain would impose. Southern England more. Broadley is forecast to reach 24 to 26 degrees Celsius. The Midlands and Wales sit in the low to mid-20s. Scotland and Northern Ireland will be milder at 18 to 21 degrees Celsius, feeling warm but not exceptional by their own standards. The gradient between the southeast corner of England sitting at 27 degrees and Scotland sitting at 18 degrees represents a temperature range of nearly 10 degrees across the same island on the same afternoon. A reminder of how dramatically different the thermal experience of a warm weather event can be depending on where within the UK you happen to be standing when the thermometers peak. The global comparison that accompanies this forecast is genuinely striking. On the day that London and East Anglia are forecast to reach 27 degrees Celsius, Honolulu in Hawaii is forecast at 26 degrees Celsius, Athens at 25 degrees Celsius, and Sydney at 24 degrees Celsius. Buenos Aires and Tunis are both around 22 degrees Celsius. The fact that central London is simultaneously outrunning Hawaii, Athens, and Sydney on a May afternoon is not a quirk of microclimate. It is a signal that the air mass sitting over southern England is carrying a temperature signature that the southerly flow delivering this warmth is not just moving air. It is moving the climate of Spain and France northward into a country whose buildings, health systems, and population were calibrated for a very different thermal baseline. The historical context for a 27-degree reading in May is where this forecast acquires its full significance. The highest temperature ever recorded in the UK during the month of May remains 29.4 degrees Celsius, set at East Finchley in London in 1944 during a prolonged dry spell in wartime conditions. More recent benchmarks include 25.1 degrees Celsius recorded at Northolt in 2017 and 27.5 degrees Celsius recorded in East Anglia in 2018. The 2026 forecast of 27 degrees Celsius sits directly in the range of those recent historical highs, above the 2017 Northolt reading and approaching the 2018 East Anglia peak. If it verifies at the top of its projected range, it becomes one of the highest May temperatures recorded in the UK in the post-war period, sitting in a top 5 bracket for the month, and confirming a trend that the Met Office's own data documents with unmistakable clarity. Looking back at the historical record of May warm spells, the pattern is one of progressive escalation. 1976 brought prolonged May heat that led to national drought and hosepipe bans across the summer. 1990 and 2006 featured May peaks above 25 degrees Celsius. 2017 pushed toward the mid-25s. 2018 reached 27.5 degrees in East Anglia. And now 2026 is approaching that same level before the month is even half over. The direction of the trend does not require sophisticated statistical analysis to read. It is visible to the naked eye in the data. The World Weather Attribution Organization's analysis of early season heat events in the UK provides the scientific framing for understanding why the 27-degree May forecast carries greater significance than the same number arriving in July would. WWA's research has established explicitly that early season heat waves tend to be particularly deadly precisely because the population has not yet acclimatized to high temperatures and is often less prepared. The acclimatization process that allows the body to manage heat more efficiently, involving cardiovascular adjustment, improved sweat response efficiency, and hormonal recalibration of fluid balance, requires sustained warm exposure across 7 to 14 days to meaningfully progress. A 27-degree day arriving in May, after a spring that has oscillated between cold snaps and warm spells without providing the sustained progressive warmth needed for acclimatization, arrives into a physiologically unprepared population in the same way that a sudden physical demand would arrive for an athlete who had been resting rather than training. The body can manage it, but it manages it less efficiently, with higher cardiovascular strain and with a narrower margin for error if any complicating factor, dehydration, an underlying condition, a hot enclosed environment, reduces that margin further. The specific locations where 27 degrees is most likely to be recorded carry their own specific risk profiles that go beyond the headline temperature number. Heathrow Airport, identified as one of the monitoring stations most likely to register the peak reading, is one of the busiest airports in the world and one of the largest employers in the United Kingdom. Thousands of workers across the airport's operations, ground handlers loading and unloading aircraft in direct sunlight, engineers conducting maintenance on exposed tarmac aprons, construction workers on active site projects around the terminal expansions, will be working through the peak of a 27-degree afternoon in environments where shade is limited and the radiant heat from aircraft surfaces, tarmac, and jet blast adds significantly to the ambient temperature experienced at ground level. Kew Gardens, the other location flagged in the forecast as a likely peak reading site, is one of the most visited attractions in London and will be hosting large numbers of visitors, including children and older adults, in an outdoor environment on one of the warmest days of the year. Cambridge, identified alongside London as a likely 27-degree location in East Anglia, is home to a university city with dense student population, and the UK HSA's heat health alert system has a specific relevance to a single-day 27-degree event that is worth understanding clearly because it shapes the operational responses that NHS trusts, local authorities, and social care providers will be activating in response to this forecast. The core alerting season runs from June 4th to September 30th, which means that a 27-degree event in mid-May, if it triggers alert conditions, would require an extraordinary alert, a designation that activates the same operational responses as an in-season alert, but at a time when organizations are not yet in their full summer heat readiness posture. Yellow alert level, the first escalation above green baseline, triggers enhanced monitoring of high-risk individuals, proactive outreach by social care providers to elderly and vulnerable people on their registers, and specific communications to primary care about heat-related illness recognition and management. Amber level triggers NHS-wide coordination and elevated ambulance readiness. Whether the 27-degree forecast triggers extraordinary alert activation depends on the UKHSA's assessment of the health risk profile of the event, its duration, the overnight minimums that precede and follow the peak day, and the geographic distribution of the warmth across the population. A single 27-degree afternoon in May sits close to, but not definitively within the alert activation zone, and the decision will be made on the basis of the full meteorological picture rather than the single peak temperature number alone. The pollen dimension of a 27-degree May day compounds the health impact in a way that gets lost when weather coverage focuses exclusively on the temperature. The UK Health Alliance on Climate Change and multiple allergy research organizations have documented the direct relationship between warm, dry, sunny, low wind conditions, precisely the conditions this forecast is delivering, and elevated pollen concentrations in the air. May is already a high pollen month, with tree pollen season typically peaking through April and May, and grass pollen season beginning to build from mid-May onward. A 27-degree day under a stable high-pressure system will produce very high to extreme pollen counts across the southeast and East Anglia, affecting the estimated 13 million people in the UK who manage hay fever or seasonal allergic rhinitis. For those individuals, the compounding of heat stress and elevated allergenic exposure, both of which place demands on the respiratory and immune system simultaneously, represents a more significant health burden than either condition in isolation. The antihistamines that many hay fever sufferers take daily can reduce sweating efficiency in some formulations, creating a physiological interaction that increases heat. Stress risk on the same day that pollen exposure is highest. This interaction is almost never communicated in warm weather public health messaging, despite being well established in the medical literature. The energy and wildlife dimension of a 27-degree May day adds layers of consequence rarely featured in temperature-focused coverage. East Anglia's offshore wind farms face a specific challenge during warm, stable, high-pressure conditions. The light winds that accompany blocking high pressure reduce wind generation output at precisely the moment electricity demand rises from fans and cooling systems across millions of homes. The national grid responds by drawing more heavily on interconnectors to mainland Europe and gas-fired generation, both carrying cost implications that eventually feed through to consumer bills. The clear skies of the high-pressure system help solar output partially offset the wind shortfall, but the combination is one the grid manages successfully but not without cost. On the ecological side, rivers like the Thames warm rapidly under sustained heat, reducing dissolved oxygen levels in ways that stress fish populations and trigger Environment Agency monitoring responses. The RSPB has documented that unusually warm May temperatures can alter the timing of bird migrations and breeding cycles, creating mismatches between the arrival of migratory species and the peak availability of the food sources they depend on. Disruptions that accumulate across successive warm springs into long-term ecological shifts that no single cooler day reverses. The practical advice that weather coverage often skips is the dimension with the most direct impact on the millions of people living in areas forecast to hit 27 degrees. The UKHSA guidelines for heat events are specific and evidence-based. Hydration means 2 to 3 liters of water across the day, beginning before thirst signals arrive. By the time thirst is strong, the body is already mildly dehydrated. Sun protection means SPF 50 or above, reapplied after 2 hours or after sweating, with hats and sunglasses worn during the 11 a.m. to 3 p.m. peak solar window. Avoiding unnecessary outdoor exertion during those peak hours and moving essential outdoor activity to morning or evening reduces heat illness risk significantly. Checking on older and vulnerable neighbors is not a social nicety on a 27-degree May day. It is a health intervention with documented effectiveness, and in a country with a large, dispersed older adult population, the difference between a check-in call and no contact can be the difference between timely intervention and a delayed emergency department presentation. The Met Office's attribution of rising May temperature extremes to human-induced warming places the 27-degree forecast in the context that ultimately matters most. The UK CP18 modeling program predicts the number of heatwave days the UK experiences will double by the 2050s. Dr. Nick Dunstone of the Met Office confirmed that in today's climate, conditions equivalent to the 1976 heat wave, which lasted more than a fortnight above 28 degrees Celsius, could now persist for a month or more. The 2026 forecast of 27 degrees Celsius in May is not the end of a warm weather story. It is the opening chapter of a summer that the Met Office's own 3-month outlook assigned 40% probability, double the normal baseline, to being hot across May through July. Jim Dale of British Weather Services was explicit that temperatures well into the 30s should be expected as summer develops, with 40 degrees Celsius possible again if Spain and the continent provide the right northward push. The 27-degree May reading, if it verifies, becomes the first confirmed data point in a 2026 temperature record already running ahead of every seasonal expectation. It is the hottest day of the year so far, and the year has barely begun to warm up.